Scott Draper had never planned to move back to the edge of town, but after years of renting cramped spaces and working night shifts for someone else's company, the inherited property felt like a quiet kind of freedom. The old industrial lot had once belonged to his uncle, a local land surveyor who had spent most of his life drawing borders for other people while neglecting his own. It wasn't much to look at now. A stretch of cracked asphalt, a few stubborn weeds pushing through it, and an aging hangar that had been converted decades ago into a storage barn. When Scott first stepped inside, the air smelled of machine oil and dust, and sunlight filtered through the slanted roof in broken ribbons. He didn't see decay. He saw potential. It was the perfect place to build his printing workshop, a hybrid between craft and industry, something he could finally call his own. The nearest houses sat far enough away that he could work late without disturbing anyone, and the property line, marked by rusted metal stakes, seemed to promise privacy and permanence. The first weeks passed quietly. He brought in second-hand machinery from the city, repaired the power lines, and fixed the dented steel doors. The neighbors rarely appeared, and when they did, they waved with polite disinterest. Scott didn't mind. He preferred silence, the kind that buzzed faintly with the hum of equipment and the low echo of wind across the open lot. At night, he'd step outside and watch the distant highway lights blink between the trees, a reminder that the world still moved, but not too close to disturb him. For the first time in years, his routine felt clean, predictable, mechanical in a good way. Every morning he would unlock the workshop, turn on the compressors, and feel the floor vibrate beneath his boots. That vibration, that pulse of industry, became his anchor. His uncle's old maps hung on one wall, curling at the edges. Scott sometimes traced the fine ink lines, studying the boundaries and coordinates as if they held some unspoken wisdom. The lot was positioned at the edge of a wide plain where, years ago, the town's expansion had stalled. Developers had lost interest, and the remaining land had been divided awkwardly between private owners and the local homeowners association that controlled the newer part of the neighborhood. His uncle's property lay just beyond their reach, or so Scott believed. It was one of those quiet technicalities that no one ever bothered to question. The road ended abruptly a few yards before his gate, the asphalt dissolving into gravel that led directly to his workshop. He liked that. It gave the place a sense of finality, like the world simply stopped there. The locals called that section of the land the buffer, a forgotten strip where the jurisdiction of the HOA supposedly ended. Scott had heard about the association only through passing remarks at the hardware store. Strict, organized, the kind of board that fined residents for leaving trash cans visible or painting fences the wrong shade of beige. Their influence was something he planned to avoid entirely. His workshop didn't sit inside their manicured world of flower beds and streetlights. It existed in the margin, beyond the neat symmetry of suburban life. He assumed that distance would protect him. But small things began to catch his attention. One morning, a pair of survey markers appeared along the dirt shoulder near his driveway, bright orange flags stabbing out of the ground like warnings. He thought they belonged to utility workers, yet no trucks came, no cables were laid. A week later, a new patch of asphalt appeared at the edge of his lot, as if someone had extended the road slightly during the night. He dismissed it at first. People often used his open space to turn their cars around. Maybe it was just wear from the tires. Still, when he measured the distance between the old stake and the new pavement, the numbers didn't match. The line had shifted by several feet, subtle but deliberate. Scott tried to ignore it. He had more immediate concerns, orders to fill, machinery to maintain, and bills to pay. Yet an unease crept in, soft and persistent. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but the awareness that something was encroaching. The land that had always seemed so certain, so defined, was beginning to blur at its edges. He caught himself staring at the horizon more often, watching the slow crawl of new streetlights appearing in the distance, like a colony expanding one lamppost at a time. The air around his property felt different now, heavier with the quiet rhythm of change. On the night before the real trouble began, Scott stood outside the workshop, leaning against the cool metal of the door and listening to the steady thrum of the machines inside. The stars above were faint, dimmed by the artificial glow spreading from the neighborhoods beyond the plain. Somewhere out there, someone was drawing new lines onto paper, redrawing the world without asking permission. He didn't know it yet, but the borders his uncle once mapped with precision were about to become the center of someone else's agenda. And the ground beneath his feet, the one thing he thought he could trust, was already being claimed by another hand. It began on a windless Monday morning, the kind where the air felt too still, as though the world were holding its breath. Scott Draper woke to the sound of engines outside. Low, heavy, industrial. At first he thought it was a delivery truck heading toward the new housing units down the road, but the noise didn't fade. It grew louder, closer, until the vibrations trembled through the walls of his workshop. He stepped outside, still half-dressed, coffee mug in hand, and froze. A crew of men in reflective vests had parked a flatbed truck across his driveway, blocking access to the lot. Behind them, a cement mixer idled, and two excavators sat poised like mechanical animals, their claws glinting in the morning light. One of the workers looked up from a clipboard and shouted over the rumble, asking if he was Mr. Draper. When Scott nodded, the man gestured toward a stack of concrete barriers already being unloaded. "Per HOA directive," he said matter-of-factly. "This access point is being closed off until compliance is verified." Scott blinked at him, struggling to understand what compliance even meant. Within minutes, the crew began lowering the barriers in front of his gate, sealing the entrance as if he were under quarantine. Scott moved closer, voice raised over the mechanical noise, asking what the hell they were doing. A woman in a navy windbreaker approached from a white SUV parked on the newly paved section of road. She carried a folder under her arm and introduced herself as Lauren Quinn, Regional Coordinator for the Meadowview Homeowners Association. Her tone was clipped, efficient, rehearsed. She informed him that his unauthorized structure, meaning his workshop, was obstructing an easement designated for emergency and maintenance access. She handed him a letter stamped with the HOA insignia, paragraphs of dense legal phrasing that accused him of willful obstruction of community property. He read the first few lines and felt the heat crawl up his neck. The letter demanded immediate removal of the structure, or enforcement measures would follow. It cited sections and codes he'd never heard of, none of which seemed remotely connected to his land. Scott tried to explain that the building had existed for decades, long before the HOA or even the development itself. It wasn't new, it wasn't temporary, and it certainly wasn't blocking any legitimate road. Lauren's smile didn't waver. It was the kind of expression people wear when they've already decided not to listen. She suggested he coordinate with the compliance office and turned away, leaving him standing in the dust as the workers finished setting up the barriers. He felt absurdly powerless, watching as they erected a wall across the only entrance to his own property. When he demanded they stop, the foreman told him to take it up with the board and refused to continue the conversation. By noon, the lot was effectively sealed off. The noise died down, the trucks left, and the silence that followed was worse than the chaos. Inside the workshop, Scott paced between machines that had suddenly become useless. His delivery van sat trapped behind concrete. Orders were pending, materials waiting to be shipped, and now he couldn't even move his products out. He reread the letter until the words blurred together. Every line sounded like something designed to confuse rather than inform. The phrasing was precise but hollow. sentences written to sound legitimate while hiding the fact that none of it made sense. He checked the coordinates listed in the notice and realized the so-called easement overlapped perfectly with the footprint of his building. Whoever had drawn this map had simply dropped a road through the center of his workshop and called it legal. He spent the afternoon on the phone with the county office, being transferred from one department to another. Some clerks sounded sympathetic, others impatient, but none could give a clear answer. The most consistent response was that any dispute involving the HOA had to be handled directly with their administration. The phrase repeated like a loop until Scott nearly slammed the phone against the wall. When he finally reached someone in zoning, the clerk hesitated before saying quietly, "If their easement wasn't recorded through the county, it's not official, but you'd need documentation to prove that." She paused, then added, "I'd move fast. They tend to act first and apologize later." That night, as the temperature dropped, Scott stood by the barrier and ran his hand along the cold concrete surface. His property lights reflected off the rough surface, throwing long shadows across the ground. The space that had once felt open and is now looked like a cage. He thought of calling his uncle's old colleagues, maybe someone from the surveyor's office who remembered the original lot lines, but it had been years since any of them were alive or working. He was on his own. The following morning he woke to a sharp metallic clang. Someone was driving new stakes into the soil along the edge of his property. Through the haze of early light, he saw two workers from the same crew marking the ground with orange paint, tracing a path that cut directly behind his workshop. One of them nodded at him politely, as if nothing about this situation was strange, and said they were finalizing the boundary for roadway verification. The word roadway echoed in his head like an accusation. He asked for their permit, but they shrugged and said all authorizations were filed through HOA channels. By midday, a fresh coat of asphalt had appeared beyond the barrier, connecting seamlessly to the rest of the subdivision. It was done with such speed and precision that Scott suspected it had been planned weeks in advance. They weren't reacting to his presence. They were expanding over him. It dawned on him that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategy. The HOA wasn't confused about ownership. They were simply claiming land they didn't want to buy. His building stood in the way, so they decided to make it disappear on paper before doing it in reality. He walked the perimeter with a measuring tape, checking the stakes against the dimensions from his uncle's old maps. The difference was undeniable. The new road carved a 30-foot wide scar right through his property. Each stake represented a piece of land the HOA was attempting to absorb, and each one carried their emblem, small stamped metal tags that gleamed like signatures. When he crouched to inspect one, he noticed the serial number etched into it had been filed off. Whoever had placed them didn't want them traced. That evening, he typed out a formal complaint, attached scanned copies of his deed, and sent them to every relevant office he could think of. The county surveyor, zoning commission, property registry, even the HOA itself. He knew the odds were slim that anyone would respond, but he had to start somewhere. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. Outside, the night was too quiet again. The road beyond the barrier was empty, yet he could see the faint reflection of headlights in the distance, pausing as if someone were parked there watching. He stood at the window for several minutes, waiting for the lights to move. They didn't. Eventually he turned away, but the image stayed in his mind long after he lay down. When morning came, the letter from the HOA was gone from his front door, replaced by another envelope, this one thinner, colder in its wording. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a notice of enforcement. They would be proceeding with removal of the obstruction within 10 business days if he didn't comply voluntarily. The closing line read like a taunt. Failure to comply will be interpreted as forfeiture of claim to disputed land parcels. Scott read it twice, then a third time, and felt a strange calm settle over him. They were already calling his property disputed, as if the matter was settled. He looked out the window again at the newly paved stretch that glistened under the morning sun, cutting cleanly across his boundary like a wound. Somewhere beneath that asphalt lay the edge of everything his uncle had once drawn, the line that defined what was his. And now someone else had erased it with a layer of tar and legal ink. Scott spent the next several days in a restless cycle of calls, research, and sleepless nights that blurred together until time itself seemed to dissolve. He barely ate, surviving on cold coffee and the dull hum of anxiety that filled his chest. The road outside was no longer just a nuisance. It was a living thing, spreading silently each night. Trucks came and went without warning, workers appeared before dawn and vanished by mid-morning, and every time he stepped outside, there was a new patch of pavement where dirt had once been. The barriers in front of his driveway now stood like gray sentinels, each marked with reflective tape and a small metal seal bearing the HOA insignia. The message was unmistakable. He was on the wrong side of the line, literally and legally. What infuriated him most was the calculated precision of it all. They didn't threaten him openly, didn't yell, didn't even speak to him anymore. They just advanced, inch by inch, with the steady inevitability of paperwork and construction equipment. On the fourth day, a notice appeared taped to one of the barriers. It was from the Meadowview Compliance Department, informing him that his property would undergo a boundary inspection later that week. The date was highlighted in bold red letters. There was no contact information, no name, just the HOA crest and a generic email address. Scott felt the weight of the trap tightening. He tried once more to reach someone at the county registrar's office, but the clerk there told him the HOA's road expansion permit had already been conditionally approved, pending verification. He demanded to know on what basis it had been approved when the land clearly belonged to him, but the clerk's tone turned defensive. "If you have evidence to the contrary," she said, "you'll need to file a motion for review. Until then, it's considered a community project." Community project. The words struck him as obscene. That evening he walked the perimeter again, his boots crunching against gravel, a flashlight in his hand. The fresh asphalt gave off a chemical tang that clung to the air, sharp and artificial. At the far end of his property, he found something new, a metal post with a laminated sign that read, "Future Access Lane. Authorized construction only." Beneath it was a barcode and a series of reference numbers, all perfectly legitimate looking. But when he scanned the code on his phone, it led to an error page. He took a photo, documenting everything, though he had no idea who would care. The land that had once felt so certain now resembled a stage being quietly rebuilt while the audience was distracted. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was orchestrating this from a distance. Someone who knew exactly how far they could bend the law without breaking it. When the inspection day arrived, 3 vehicles pulled up outside the barrier. A county utility truck, an SUV marked with the HOA logo, and a third car with no markings at all. From the SUV stepped Lauren Quinn, crisp as ever in her tailored jacket, clipboard in hand. The others were strangers. A surveyor with a measuring tripod and a man in a gray suit who didn't introduce himself. Scott came out to meet them, heart pounding, clutching his property file like a shield. Lauren greeted him with that same fixed smile, asking if he had received the notice. He told her yes, and that he objected to the inspection on private land. She tilted her head slightly, as though amused, and replied that his objection had been noted but would not prevent the process from moving forward. The surveyor set up his equipment without a word, driving metal rods into the soil and aligning them with small digital sensors. The man in the suit observed silently, occasionally nodding as if confirming something invisible. Scott stood nearby, trying to interject, showing them the deed, the maps, his uncle's original surveys. No one looked at the papers. Lauren took a single glance and said they appeared outdated and in need of revision. When he pressed for specifics, what date, what statute, what jurisdiction, she deflected with bureaucratic smoothness, saying the HOA's zoning authority operated under regional coordination standards that superseded older private filings. It sounded like pure nonsense, but she said it with the confidence of someone who expected not to be questioned. After 2 hours of measurements and murmured discussions, they packed up and left without explanation. The only trace they left behind were fresh neon markers dotting the edge of his workshop. Scott tore one out of the ground and saw it was tagged with a code identical to the one from the false construction sign. That night, unable to sleep, he spread all his documents across the floor, maps, deeds, correspondence, even his uncle's handwritten notes. One corner of an old blueprint caught his eye, a faint red line labeled Unregistered Easement, Temporary, Revoked 1994. It ran exactly where the new road now lay. His uncle must have drawn it decades ago for a project that was later abandoned. Somehow, someone at the HOA had found that line and resurrected it, treating a dead proposal as a legal foundation. It was genius in its audacity. The realization filled him with both awe and dread. He stayed up until dawn, drafting a summary of his findings, attaching photos and scanned maps, and sent them to the county board with a formal complaint of property encroachment. When he checked his email the next day, every message had bounced back with a notice, recipient unavailable. He tried again using a different address, and again the same result. It was as if the channels themselves had closed overnight. Around noon, another letter appeared, slipped under his gate this time. It bore no signature, only a printed message. Unauthorized modification of inspection materials constitutes interference with community oversight. Further incidents will be documented for legal action. Attached to it was a photograph of him tearing out one of the survey markers, the image taken from an angle that could only have come from a mounted camera. He looked around the property, scanning the poles and corners of the lot, and spotted a small black device near the top of a utility post. The HOA had installed surveillance under the pretense of inspection. He spent the afternoon dismantling his printer equipment, partly to calm his nerves and partly to feel in control of something. The machines whirred and clanked, obedient, indifferent to the world beyond the walls. For a few hours, he almost forgot about the road, the letters, the invisible watchers. But when he stepped outside that evening, he froze. A new temporary sign stood beside the barrier, larger this time, reading Community Access Road, pending clearance. Below, in smaller letters, it stated, Construction to resume upon removal of obstructions. His workshop was the obstruction. He was the obstruction. The message was so blunt it felt like a declaration of war. Later that night, as the moon rose, Scott walked to the edge of the new asphalt and knelt. The surface was still warm from the day's heat, smooth and flawless. Beneath that thin layer of tar and gravel lay decades of history, his uncle's careful surveys, the old soil lines, the physical proof of ownership, all buried under a single decision made without his consent. He thought of tearing it up, renting a jackhammer, doing something reckless, but he knew that was exactly what they wanted. If he acted out, they could call him unstable, dangerous, a threat to community order. Instead, he stood there until the cold crept up through his knees, watching the horizon where the distant lights of the subdivision blinked like indifferent stars. For the first time, he understood that this was not a misunderstanding or an administrative error. It was a campaign, precise and deliberate, designed to wear him down until he either surrendered or disappeared. The ground beneath him, once the symbol of independence, now felt like borrowed space, quiet, temporary, waiting for someone else's permission to exist. By the end of the second week, the weight of the conflict had begun to feel physical, like a pressure lodged in Scott's chest that refused to ease no matter how many hours he spent pacing or how deeply he tried to breathe. The workshop, once a space of focus and purpose, had turned into a kind of bunker, lit by the cold glow of his computer screens and cluttered with maps, photocopies, and printouts. He slept on the couch most nights, too anxious to return to the house. The road outside had gone quiet for a few days, and that silence worried him more than the noise ever had. It meant they were planning something, moving in shadows, reshaping paperwork instead of asphalt. When the letter came, it wasn't by post. It was slipped under his door, just like the last one, though this time it carried a formal letterhead from the county's Land Adjustment Division. The language was sharp and precise, informing him that a petition had been filed by the Meadowview Homeowners Association to clarify property boundaries and resolve conflicting usage rights. It read as if both parties had agreed to this proceeding, which he hadn't. At the bottom was a printed signature of someone named D. Renner, Boundary Compliance Officer. He'd never heard of the man, but the title carried enough authority to make his stomach knot. The notice stated that preliminary review would begin within 5 business days, and that any objections must be filed with supporting documentation by that date. 5 days. He had already sent everything, maps, deeds, scans, but none of it had reached the county office. Now they were giving him less than a week to prepare a defense in a process he hadn't even initiated. It was so methodical, so bureaucratically elegant, that he almost admired it. They weren't bulldozing his land with machines anymore. They were doing it with signatures. For 2 days straight, he immersed himself in his uncle's old archives, opening drawers he hadn't touched since moving in. There were dozens of folders filled with brittle papers and hand-drawn maps from the early 1990s. Many of them bore the same initials, EJD, his uncle's, alongside notes written in his sharp, meticulous handwriting. Most were ordinary job records, property surveys, drainage layouts, and topographic studies for small developments long since completed. But one folder caught Scott's attention. Its label was smudged, and inside he found a faded envelope containing what looked like a partial deed transfer. The document referred to a conditional easement that had been proposed between the county and a private landowner, his uncle. The easement had been revoked officially, but there were handwritten comments in the margins. Temporary use allowed until restoration, private ownership retained. The coordinates matched the same narrow strip where the new HOA road now ran. Scott stared at the page for nearly an hour, his mind tracing the implications. If the easement had been temporary and officially revoked, then the HOA's claim on that land was built on a false assumption. But it wasn't enough to know it. He needed proof the revocation had been recorded. He checked the county's online archive again, cross-referencing the document ID, but the page showed record not found. Either it had been removed or it was never digitized. He'd have to find the physical copy. The next morning, he drove into town for the first time in weeks. The world beyond his property felt strangely distant, smaller somehow. People walked their dogs, chatted outside cafes, oblivious to the slow war being fought just a few miles away. The county records office was a concrete building with sun-faded posters on the walls reminding visitors to protect your property rights. Scott almost laughed at the irony. Inside, he explained his situation to a clerk who looked no older than 25. She listened politely, typing as he spoke, and finally nodded. "That easement was archived years ago," she said. "But if it was revoked, it should be in our physical storage. You'll need to submit a retrieval request." He filled out the form, but when she saw the coordinates, her expression shifted subtly. She excused herself, disappearing into a back room, and returned several minutes later with a forced smile. "It looks like that file is under restricted access," she said carefully. "You'd have to contact the compliance officer listed in your notice, Mr. Renner." Scott asked for Renner's contact information, and she reluctantly gave him a number. When he called, it went straight to voicemail. He left a detailed message, then another later that day, but neither was returned. That night, as he sat on the porch nursing a beer, he thought about his uncle and the strange loyalty the man had always shown towards systems that ultimately betrayed him. His uncle had spent his life ensuring lines were drawn correctly, boundaries measured fairly, yet his work was now being twisted into something predatory. The thought of it ignited a kind of grim resolve in Scott. If they were going to use his uncle's maps against him, then he'd use those same maps to destroy their case. The following day, he went back into the workshop and began a painstaking comparison between the old paper surveys and the modern digital parcels displayed on the county's website. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. Small shifts in coordinate points, altered elevation readings, even modified slope indicators. Someone had deliberately reinterpreted the data to justify the road. His uncle's original survey had recorded the property line 22 feet east of where the HOA's version now placed it. That margin was exactly the width of the new asphalt strip. It was almost elegant, the precision of their theft. Late that night, as rain started to fall in soft, erratic drizzles, Scott was hunched over his desk, surrounded by maps, when the power flickered. The lights dimmed once, then steadied, then went out entirely. The workshop plunged into silence except for the steady tapping of rain on the roof. He stepped outside, expecting to see a blackout across the neighborhood, but the houses beyond the barrier glowed with steady yellow light. Only his property was dark. The meter box on the side of the building had been sealed with a new padlock bearing a barcode sticker. He tore it off and read the fine print. Service disconnection. Unauthorized utility access pending verification. The HOA had cut his electricity. It wasn't even subtle anymore. He stood there in the rain, soaked and shaking, realizing they were tightening the circle one layer at a time. Utilities, access, legality, existence. He spent the rest of the night by candlelight, poring over documents until the wax burned down to stubs. Somewhere around dawn he noticed something odd. One of his uncle's old topographical sketches had faint pencil marks around the revoked easement. He tilted the paper under the light and could make out a faint note. Backup file, steel case, under refrigeration. It took him several minutes to understand what that meant, and when he did, his pulse quickened. Years ago, his uncle had mentioned installing a hidden storage compartment beneath the floor of the old workshop refrigerator. Scott had assumed it was one of those eccentric habits old men developed, but now it made perfect sense. He pushed the heavy industrial freezer away from the wall, revealing a rectangular metal plate bolted into the floor. The bolts were rusted, but he pried them loose with a wrench, then lifted the panel to reveal a shallow compartment filled with dust and a single weatherproof case. Inside were several rolled documents sealed in plastic sleeves, along with a small leather notebook. The papers were brittle but legible. The original signed easement agreement, the official notice of revocation from the county commissioner's office, and a statement confirming that the land remained private property after the revocation. The signatures were clear, the seals embossed and authentic. His uncle had kept the originals hidden all these years, probably out of distrust for the system he once served. And now, that distrust had saved them both. Scott spread the documents across the work table and read them carefully, cross-checking every line, every date. It was all there. The evidence the HOA could never refute. He photographed everything, scanned the pages, and made multiple backups. But what unsettled him most wasn't the discovery itself. It was the quiet certainty that followed. He realized this wasn't going to end in polite negotiations or bureaucratic corrections. He had just become the one person capable of exposing a fraud that likely stretched beyond his property. The HOA hadn't simply built a road in the wrong place. They had manipulated land records, forged digital maps, and used legal intimidation to seize private land. If the county offices were complicit, his evidence would make enemies out of powerful people. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a calm that wasn't fear or resignation. It was purpose. The road outside still cut across his land, the barrier still stood, and the lights from the subdivision still glowed in the distance, but now those things looked different. They weren't symbols of defeat anymore. They were proof of how far the lie had spread. He knew what he had to do next. He didn't need allies or publicity or sympathy. He needed precision, the same precision his uncle had lived by. The truth was buried under asphalt and bureaucracy, but he had just found the shovel. The following week arrived with the dull heaviness of a storm that never broke. Scott moved through the days with quiet, deliberate purpose, though inside he could feel the tension coiling tighter. He had the documents, the real ones, signed and sealed, and he knew they were enough to dismantle everything the HOA had built on lies. But power didn't yield to paper. It fought back with silence. He sent copies of the revocation and ownership documents to the county offices by certified mail, to the Land Adjustment Division, and to the same compliance officer who had signed the petition, D. Renner. He also delivered a sealed packet in person to the courthouse drop box, just to make sure it couldn't go missing. Afterward, he felt a brief flicker of relief, but it vanished the next morning when he stepped outside and saw what had been done. Sometime during the night, a crew had come again. Not construction workers this time, but contractors in unmarked vehicles. They had fenced off the section of land nearest the road with metal panels, claiming it as restricted work zone. A new sign hung from the barrier, survey in progress, do not enter. Scott's mailbox was gone, ripped out of the ground, and the gate lock had been replaced with a different one. When he confronted the workers, they told him to contact the HOA's legal department. None of them would give names, and one of them, a large man with a shaved head, stood too close as he spoke, making it clear that arguing further wouldn't end well. The old sense of isolation he'd felt at the start returned now, but heavier, charged with something darker. They weren't just ignoring him anymore. They were trying to erase him from the landscape. He called the county office to confirm receipt of his documents. The woman who answered said politely that she could find no record of any submission. When he gave her the tracking numbers, she paused for too long, then muttered that the files were pending entry, and quickly ended the call. Within the hour, he received a new email from the HOA titled Notice of Trespass Concern. The body of the message accused him of interfering with authorized fieldwork and warned that continued disruption could lead to legal action. It was the kind of message designed not to threaten directly, but to make him doubt whether he had already crossed some invisible line. By evening, rain began to fall again, the same slow, persistent drizzle that turned the asphalt slick and black. Scott stood at the edge of the fence watching the water pool around the barriers. The lot felt foreign now, as though it had shifted ownership overnight. Every sound carried too far, the hiss of tires on the wet road, the metallic creak of the fence panels swaying in the wind, the dull hum of transformers somewhere in the dark. He felt like an intruder on his own ground. 2 days later, he received an official envelope bearing the seal of the county court. Inside was a notice of a civil complaint filed by the Meadowview Homeowners Association, alleging obstruction of public right-of-way and interference with public safety infrastructure. The language was clean, confident, and maddeningly vague. They were suing him preemptively, perhaps anticipating the complaint he had sent. The attached schedule listed an expedited hearing, barely a week away. They had maneuvered faster than he thought possible. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in the workshop surrounded by maps and documents, listening to the faint patter of rain on the roof. The machines around him stood silent, hulking shapes in the dark. He thought about his uncle again, about the years the man had spent fighting minor zoning errors and watching as others twisted his work to their benefit. There had always been a quiet warning in his uncle's voice. Lines are only real if someone respects them. Now Scott understood the weight of that statement. The line that defined his land existed only on fragile sheets of paper, and those papers could be buried, edited, or misfiled. The next morning, before dawn, he drove to the county records building again. The clerk at the front desk, the same young woman as before, looked startled to see him. When he asked about his file, she said softly that she couldn't discuss active cases. He pressed harder, asking about the revocation record for the easement. Her expression changed, tightening with discomfort. "Those documents are being re-evaluated," she said finally. "It's part of an internal audit." The phrase made him laugh bitterly. It meant they were being buried again. As he turned to leave, she added in a near whisper, "Be careful. You're on the wrong side of something big." When he returned home, the fence line had been extended farther into his property. They'd even staked a small construction materials container near the barrier, filled with rebar and wooden planks. The audacity of it was almost surreal. They were physically occupying his land under the guise of safety. He walked the perimeter, taking photos of everything, careful to document each intrusion, but he knew evidence alone wouldn't stop them. They weren't afraid of facts. They were betting he'd collapse under pressure first. That afternoon, as he sorted through the photos on his computer, his internet connection suddenly cut out. He checked the router, then his service panel, and found a note taped inside the box. "Temporary disconnection. Account under review." It wasn't signed. He laughed out loud then, a sharp, humorless sound. The pattern was too consistent to be random. Each piece of his independence, access, utilities, communication was being stripped away, one layer at a time. The following night he heard engines again, quieter this time. When he stepped outside, he saw headlights moving slowly beyond the fence, scanning the property line. He couldn't see faces, only shadows shifting behind the glare. For a brief, dangerous moment, he considered confronting them, but he stayed still, watching until the lights faded into the distance. When he went back inside, he noticed the faint glow of a small red light near the window. Another camera, this one fixed directly on his door. He didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, he sat at the table reading through the court notice, line by line, dissecting every phrase. The HOA's argument rested entirely on the claim that the road was a designated emergency access corridor, a classification that required approval from both the fire department and the county engineer. If he could prove those approvals didn't exist, their case would collapse. He began combing through public records online, and after several hours, he found a discrepancy. The road's permit listed a temporary approval date from 8 years earlier, signed by a fire marshal who had retired 6 years ago. It was a ghost authorization. Never renewed, never made permanent. That was their weak point. The realization steadied him. He printed the permit record, highlighted the inconsistencies, and drafted his own response to the court. The next morning, he delivered the packet in person, handing it directly to the clerk to ensure it couldn't vanish this time. On the drive back, he passed the row of houses that belonged to the HOA board members, identical facades, manicured lawns, the illusion of order. Behind those doors, people like Lauren Quinn were writing policies that devoured the very land they claimed to protect. When he returned home, the fence had been painted with a fresh coat of reflective white. The words, "Authorized Work Zone," gleamed in the sunlight like a scar. He stood there for a long time, feeling the air hum with quiet electricity. They thought they had already beaten him, that they could build over his life and call it progress. But for the first time, the fear began to slip away, replaced by something colder and steadier, a determination that bordered on defiance. The land beneath the asphalt still remembered its shape, and so did he. The battle was no longer about ownership papers or permits. It was about the simple, stubborn truth that some lines, once drawn, could not be erased without consequence. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, gray and airless, the kind of day that pressed against the skin and dulled every sound. Scott arrived early, carrying a weathered briefcase filled with his uncle's documents, maps, and photographs. Every scrap of proof he had managed to gather. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of coffee and of old carpet, and the hum of conversation around him felt distant, as though happening in another world. He wasn't represented by a lawyer. He couldn't afford one and didn't trust anyone else to tell his story. Across the room, seated together at a polished oak table, were the representatives of the Meadowview Homeowners Association. Lauren Quinn sat at the center, immaculate as always, flanked by two men in suits who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a real estate brochure. They didn't glance at him when he entered, though he could feel their confidence radiating across the space like heat from a furnace. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, began the session promptly. Her tone was brisk, professional, but not unkind. She reviewed the complaint aloud, summarizing the HOA's claim that the workshop was obstructing a designated public easement essential for emergency access. The phrasing made Scott's skin crawl. He stood when prompted, hands clasped behind his back, and waited for the moment he could speak. Lauren's attorney went first, delivering a well-rehearsed argument about community welfare, safety obligations, and the historical use of the access road. He cited county statutes and waved copies of glossy maps that painted Scott's property as an anomaly, a stubborn holdout against civic order. When it was Scott's turn, the judge gave a small nod, inviting him forward. He spoke calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. He explained that the structure had existed for decades, predating both the development and the HOA itself. He presented the official notice of easement revocation, the signed county documents his uncle had preserved, and the digital record showing that the HOA's permit relied on an expired authorization. The courtroom fell quiet as he placed each document on the table, methodically, like cards in a slow game of patience. Lauren's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of unease breaking through her composure. Her attorney objected to the relevance of the older documents, claiming they were outdated, but the judge asked to see them anyway. For nearly half an hour, the judge examined the papers, comparing signatures and dates. When she finally looked up, her tone had changed. "Ms. Quinn," she said evenly, "can you produce evidence that the easement in question was reinstated after its revocation in 1994? Lauren hesitated, then deferred to her attorney, who muttered something about pending administrative updates. The judge's brows drew together. She asked again, more sharply, whether any record existed of the reinstatement. There was none. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Scott could feel his pulse in his fingertips. The judge leaned back, her expression unreadable, then turned her gaze toward him. "Mr. Draper," she said, "do you have proof that this revocation remains valid under current jurisdiction?" He nodded and handed over the notarized county confirmation, the one bearing the original seal. The judge examined it carefully, then placed it on the pile of evidence before her. What followed felt like a long exhale after weeks of suffocation. The judge's ruling came quietly but decisively. The road was to be classified as an unauthorized construction pending removal, and the land beneath it legally belonged to Scott Draper. The HOA's claims were dismissed, their petition for enforcement denied, and the association was ordered to suspend all activity on the disputed property until further review. Lauren's face drained of color, her practiced smile dissolving into something colder. The attorney whispered something in her ear, but she didn't respond. Scott stood motionless as the words sank in, his mind almost refusing to accept that it was over, that he'd actually won. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharper, the sky brighter. Reporters weren't waiting, no crowd applauded. The victory was quiet, private, but it carried a weight far greater than celebration. He drove home through streets that seemed newly drawn, noticing the way the light fell on every curb and signpost, all those little symbols of order that had nearly consumed him. When he reached his property, the barriers were still there, pale against the asphalt, but now they looked different. They were temporary, hollow gestures of authority soon to be dismantled. He parked by the gate and got out, letting the cool wind brush against his face. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe without fear. Over the next few days, official vehicles began arriving one by one. County inspectors marked the asphalt with white paint, indicating where removal would begin. Workers cut the fence panels down, loading them onto trucks. Lauren didn't appear again, though Scott received a formal letter from the HOA's legal department announcing her resignation for personal reasons. The association itself was placed under administrative review, its finances frozen pending an audit. It turned out the fraudulent road wasn't the only irregularity they had hidden. For years, they had shifted property lines and fees to inflate their budget, using community projects as a cover. The investigation spread faster than anyone expected. On the morning the demolition crew arrived to tear up the road, Scott stood by the edge of his land, watching the machines grind into the asphalt. The black surface cracked and curled like old skin, revealing the soil beneath. His soil, dry and pale and stubbornly intact after everything that had been done to bury it. The noise was deafening, yet strangely cleansing. He thought of his uncle again, of the way the man used to talk about truth as something you could measure if you knew where to place the stakes. For months, Scott had been told that his boundaries didn't exist, that ownership was a matter of interpretation. But the earth beneath that broken road said otherwise. The land remembered its shape, even when men forgot. When the last truck left and the workers were gone, he walked along the newly cleared stretch, the smell of torn asphalt still sharp in the air. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. He reached down, scooped up a handful of dirt, and let it sift through his fingers. It felt heavy, real, his again. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was earned. In the weeks that followed, the quiet returned, not the hollow, uneasy silence that had filled the air before, but something steadier, more human. The land no longer felt watched. The crews had gone, the fences were dismantled, and where the road had once cut across his property, there was only a long stretch of raw, uneven soil waiting to heal. The county sent a final notice confirming the full restoration of ownership boundaries, stamped and signed in clean ink without ambiguity. Scott kept it folded in his wallet, not out of paranoia, but as a reminder that the line was his again, that the fight had not been imagined. The HOA board, once so untouchable, collapsed under its own weight. The audit revealed layers of falsified expenditures, fabricated contracts, and unreported transfers of community funds. What had started as one man's boundary dispute exposed a quiet system of control that had been spreading for years beneath the polished language of neighborhood improvement. For a time, neighbors who had once ignored him began stopping by, some offering apologies, others curious to see the land that had caused so much trouble. Scott accepted their words politely but without warmth. He didn't feel angry, just distant, as if the battle had aged him in a way that couldn't be undone. He repaired the front gate, repainted the workshop door, and let the rest of the property remain as it was, untamed, imperfect, honest. The machines inside hummed again, steady and familiar, and each time he switched them on, the sound carried a sense of normalcy he'd almost forgotten existed. On the edge of the reclaimed ground, He planted a line of young trees, not in neat rows, but naturally, the way wind scatters seeds. When people asked why, he said it was to hold the soil, but the truth ran deeper. The trees marked the old road's path, a living boundary that no one could pave over again. In the evenings he would stand by them, watching the light shift through their leaves and feel something close to peace. The fight had cost him time, sleep, and faith in most institutions, yet it had also given him a kind of certainty that couldn't be written into law, the certainty that ownership, in the truest sense, is not about papers or deeds, but about endurance. Sometimes, when the air was still and the machines inside had gone quiet, he thought of his uncle and imagined him standing there too, surveying the land with that familiar precision, approving of the way the horizon finally looked right again. The markers were gone, the maps restored, but the real boundary existed only in his memory now, running like a quiet promise through the soil. Scott turned the lights off each night without checking the windows, without waiting for engines or letters or voices from the dark. The land was his, and for the first time it felt like it recognized him in return.